Welcome to the Sweet Science of Fighting podcast. We had a last minute guest cancel for this week's podcast. So I'm jumping in, doing a solo one for you. Actually, done quite a bit of content recently. So I'm going to kind of go through some of the content that I've done and essentially doing a podcast format for you for the ones that maybe don't like to consume YouTube videos or short form stuff. This would be kind of like a recap, I guess you could say, and going, I guess, as I flesh out some of my thoughts on the different topics. And then tomorrow there will be a live podcast. Dr. Andrew Pachado will be on, and that'll be for the following week. That'll come out on the actual podcast. So if you want to tune in, 10 a.m. Central Time, he is a strength conditioning coach at the IMG Academy in Florida. So it'll be a really good chat, that one, as we chat through some of his various research and whatnot. One of the things that can really help this podcast, if you enjoy listening to it, please make sure to leave a review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this. That helps more than you know. Comment on things, like posts, all that kind of stuff helps tremendously when it comes to supporting this podcast. Other than that, I had a listener ask about a book basically covering various combat sports, strength conditioning, or I guess kind of like an easy to follow training strength conditioning book that would cover like programs, kind of philosophy of training, all that kind of stuff. I don't know if that's something that would interest you guys. If I write a book or something on this stuff, if that would interest you, let me know. It'd be interesting to see if people would still want something like that as almost like an easy reference to come back to instead of trying to find things in videos and stuff all the time. So if that is something, just, I don't know, shoot me an email or DM or something, if that's something that you think would be useful or interesting for yourself. And I can kind of assess from there. But I wanted to cover a few things. I actually just released a video today about the Ultimate MMA Conditioning book. If you're watching this podcast, then you'll see the book there. But I'll cover that. I'll go into some of the other topics and stuff that I had as well around over-optimization and kind of worst-case scenario training, which I think is actually really interesting. Hasn't quite broken into the combat sports world yet, but I think it will eventually as it slowly becomes more professional in its setups. But the Ultimate MMA Conditioning book has been almost like a conditioning Bible for coaches and honestly any sport that needs conditioning prescribed, usually mixed sports. So things like team sports, individual sports, and I guess combat sports falls into individual sports. Any of these kind of sports that require conditioning, Ultimate MMA Conditioning is usually one of the go-to resources for this. Now, I will say, so I also used this back in the day. It was kind of like my go-to resource as well because it was so easily put together in terms of how you could just plug and play what's in there, right? Because if you're familiar with the book, it kind of breaks it down where it's like, these are aerobic training methods. So you've got like high intensity continuous training, cardiac output, etc. And then you've got anaerobic methods or anaerobic lactic methods. And so you can kind of plug and play. And then you had like alactic methods. Now, obviously we know that the traditional energy system model is not rooted in real world physiology, where all energy systems work together. Even during an quote unquote alactic sprint, you're getting aerobic involvement and you're getting increases in lactate. So the name doesn't really make sense. Same with anaerobic. Obviously, you're still using oxygen and you're getting increases in lactate with that too. So, I mean, there's that to it. But more so the point that because the book heavily pushes the aerobic energy system being the most important for MMA performance, which, yep, we can go with that. It's, aerobic energy system is going to give you the vast majority of the energy through an MMA match. It skewed the conditioning prescription very much to low intensity cardiac output work. Now, obviously, it's not the only thing in there, but it definitely did start to scaremonger the higher intensity intervals. And this is my interpretation. It's also interpretation that I've seen many other coaches make who've read this book that I've interacted with, where basically if I was going to sum up how that was done, it was through the eccentric versus concentric left ventricular hypertrophy from lower intensity endurance exercise versus higher intensity exercise, meaning lower intensity exercises increases the size of the heart chamber, higher intensity exercise, I'm going to say constricts, makes it smaller, essentially. So you're either having a bigger delivery system or a smaller delivery system. And this was kind of ingrained within the book where, okay, if I do too much high intensity work, I'm going to be less quote unquote aerobically fit because the delivery engine isn't going to be there. That was one of them. The other one was, I guess, the lactate threshold in this book. I'm just actually just trying to find the page while I talk about it. But obviously talking about how once that lactate starts to rise quickly, that's kind of like the end point of where the aerobic processes can keep up. And then anaerobic metabolism steps in. And then obviously if you spend too much time up there, then you're going to deplete your resources and you need to be able to try and stay under that as much as possible. And I think that's actually done more harm than good, in my opinion, in terms of conditioning prescription for combat sports. And it's done this. Why I say it's done more harm than good is because it's really put I guess, a fear of high intensity exercise because of this idea that you can separate aerobic and anaerobic, I guess, development, and that doing high intensity work makes you less aerobically fit, which is not the case, and it's not what we see within the literature, and it's not what we see within practice either. And I'll dive into that a little bit as well, because I mean, we'll start with the eccentric versus concentric left ventricular hypertrophy. Honestly, it sounds like a mouthful, but as I mentioned, it's just kind of that heart chamber getting smaller or bigger. It gets bigger by adding sarcomeres in series, so increasing our muscle fascicle length, which we've talked a lot about on the podcast and on the various YouTube videos. Whereas concentric hypertrophy is from sarcomeres in parallel, so essentially making the wall thicker, making the chamber smaller. And this is from exercise that essentially raises blood pressure. So typically strength training is where they see this kind of concentric hypertrophy adaptation. But when we look at the actual research, you're comparing endurance athletes to strength athletes. And it's kind of like an apples to oranges comparison, right? Because within combat sports, you're not really just doing one or the other. You're doing 2 to 3 strength training sessions a week, and then you're doing maybe an extra couple of conditioning sessions a week, and then you've got like 6 technical sessions a week, which is kind of your conditioning as well. So you're using a mixed approach, whereas in studies like these, endurance trained athletes are probably barely strength training, and strength trained athletes are probably doing absolutely no quote unquote cardio. So to be able to say that, these, this will happen if you do too much high intensity training as a combat athlete, I don't think really works, just because you're doing so much of everything. If you're anything like me, you're short on time. Kids, family, work, training, and having to cook meals on top of that is just not going to happen. So I'm happy to announce Trifecta Nutrition are sponsoring the podcast. You get epic meals like these ones: turkey taco bowl, Texas barbecue protein plate. These are a couple of my favorites. But it means you don't have to prepare all your own meals, and it makes getting and good nutrition relatively easy. I've tried other meal delivery companies. Most of them are too high fat, not enough carbohydrates, or if you're getting kits where you have to cook it yourself, the portions for 2 is actually for 1, especially if you are like me and you're training often. So if you want to take something off your plate and have meals like this delivered to your door, go down the description. There's a link there where you can order Trifecta meals. This is the performance line, which are higher protein and higher carbohydrate, and you can use code LIFTBIG40. You'll get 40% off your first order. The other thing is, because of that, cardiac output training is pushed so heavily because of this kind of central adaptation that you're trying to get out of it, right? Because when people talk, that's kind of how the zone 2 craze is really blowing up. The zone 2 craze is, okay, you need to do a lot of it because it's going to help increase VO2 max, which this new paper titled Much Ado About Zone 2 is new narrative review. I did a video on this on the YouTube as well, actually. I'm not going to say debunks it because it focuses more on the peripheral side, but typically when you become more well-trained, you need more intensity. Of course, endurance athletes are going to do a lot of volume of this low intensity work because they're doing a lot of volume in their races. So it makes sense for them to that's kind of like their specific training, right? But they still do a lot of high intensity work to push some of these other adaptations. But within the book, I talk about like 150 beats per minute kind of being the general guideline cutoff before you start to go, I guess you could say, out of the quote unquote aerobic zone, which obviously differs greatly from person to person. But it's made people scared of going above this during their conditioning. It's made coaches scared of prescribing things above this. And that's what's really pushed this low intensity kind of narrative around cardiac output training. Now, as I mentioned, the VO2 max values, well, I haven't mentioned this, but VO2 max is kind of like the golden child of conditioning of what people are trying to push and why zone 2 is so big. But if we actually look at the VO2 max values of fighters, it's not that high. Within the research, we're talking like 45 to 60 milliliters per kilo per minute. And if you're looking at endurance athletes, like elite endurance athletes, it's like 70 plus. And the guys in the 70s aren't exactly like high elite level. The elite level guys are much higher. So we're not talking like elite level endurance in terms of VO2 max. And it's an really interesting graph by, I can't remember the name of the paper, but they ranked essentially VO2 max values into performance levels. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And if you look at combat sports generally, on average, they fit in performance levels 1 and 2, which is only like, based on the research they found, it's only like a few hours of training a week to reach those levels. So it's not exactly very high. So it kind of begs the question then, do we need to focus on improving central function and VO2 max, or are we likely more limited peripherally, which we've talked a lot about on the podcast as well. If you've listened to Dr. Andrew Usher and Dr. John Babry on the podcast, you'll know that answer, but they've got plenty of data showing it's likely peripherally limited, especially in combat sports. So again, which begs the question, is zone 2 the best approach for that? And if we look at the new narrative review, which is really interesting, it's the title is called Much Ado About Zone 2, a narrative review assessing the efficiency or the efficacy of Zone 2 training for improving mitochondrial capacity and cardiorespiratory fitness in the general population. It's by Storashuk, I guess in 2025. Yeah, you'll find that if you just search Much Ado, ADO, about Zone 2. It's a really good narrative review on kind of summing up the current research we have on Zone 2 and the adaptations they, I guess, provide. And what's really interesting is that the current narrative is around Zone 2 being the best intensity for stimulating mitochondrial function and fat oxidation. And we'll just focus on the mitochondrial function part. They state that when compared with an equivalent volume of moderate intensity exercise, high intensity exercise generally results in greater mitochondrial signaling and adaptations. And if we go back to, I reference this a lot in the YouTube videos, the Molman and colleagues paper, where they looked at endurance training versus high intensity training versus sprint interval training on mitochondrial content and also on VO2 max. And they found that all exercise intensities led to similar increases in mitochondrial content, but sprint intervals were 2.3 times more efficient than high intensity training and 3.9 times more efficient than endurance training. So essentially, you can reach similar levels of mitochondrial content with any kind of exercise you like, but you're going to get there much faster with sprint intervals, and you're going to do it much more time efficiently, which I think is the most important point to take from this stuff is time efficiency, especially if you are a combat athlete, especially if you're an MMA. Well, I mean, even any of them. Like in combat sports, you're either like a hobbyist or recreational competitor, or you're like going for the pro, semi-pro. And it doesn't matter which level you're in, you pretty much have no time because you probably have to work a full-time job regardless of being pro versus all the way down to just being a hobbyist. You have family, and you're probably on the mats multiple times a week, sometimes multiple times a day. So then throwing in an hour-long Zone 2 session multiple times a week doesn't really make much sense in that instance. Plus, you're getting a lot of low-intensity work if you're on the mats a lot. So adding more on top, and the only way you can go to further spur adaptation is more volume, which can lead to different problems. But what's interesting is what makes higher intensities so effective? And that are really great. I'll put a quote from this paper, but the primary signaling pathway of mitochondrial biogenesis, so creating new mitochondria, is activation of the AMPK pathway. You can just think of it as like the endurance pathway, the molecular pathway for signaling endurance adaptations, basically, to make it easy, in response to increased AMP and ADP, which is essentially when ATP, you should be familiar with ATP, adenosine triphosphate, as muscle's energy source, but AMP and ADP are just the loss of phosphate from ATP when it's being used. So it becomes monophosphate and diphosphate 1 and 2. ATP is 2 phosphates, to make it really easy. And potentially reduced muscle glycogen. So what's interesting is obviously we're going to use more energy faster when we're doing high intensity. So we should get a bigger and faster buildup of AMP and ADP. But also you're going to get a faster decline in muscle glycogen, which again is going to set off that master switch, which is known as PGC1A, which is then going to go down that molecular pathway for more mitochondria, etc. So that is potentially why, well, that's probably why the high intensities become more effective than just doing a boatload of low volume. Now, low volume goes through a different pathway, but reaches the same kind of downstream effects. I won't go into too much detail. But what's interesting is the paper states from some of the research that no change in PGC1A, again, that master switch for mitochondrial creation, no change in this gene expression was reported following 30 minutes and approximately 90 minutes of zone 2 exercise. And that's you further in the paper talk about how it's like 120 to like 211 minutes approximately of zone 2 to start to see that reduction in muscle glycogen to start signaling this pathway. So you gotta do quite a bit of volume to get there. And they state that this 30 to 90 minutes probably didn't result in this because the VO2 max values of the participants in the study were relatively high at 59 milliliters per kg per minute. And if you remember from my range of like 45 to 60 in combat athletes, 60 is obviously on the higher end for many combat athletes. So 59 is quite high. What's interesting is the Molman and colleagues paper support this with their research. And they show like with mitochondrial content, you're not going to see, or you're potentially not going to see much change in mitochondrial content from endurance training. And high intensity training is, again, hit and miss, but you will see it for sprint interval training. So obviously as you get more well trained, you need to almost like shock the system to be able to continue pushing the adaptation. It's not just going to come through doing more easy work, if that makes sense. And it's funny because obviously often conditioning prescription is often based on elite endurance athletes. And that is like doing 80% of their volume at low intensities and 20% at high intensities. And this paper states like maybe it's not the 80% of zone 2 that's actually providing these mitochondrial adaptations or these elite VO2 maxes and elite mitochondrial adaptations in these athletes. It's potentially the high intensity work that they're doing on top of it that's really pushing it. So that's just some food for thought from that paper. I think it's quite interesting. I'm just seeing if there's anything else I need to add from that paper as I continue rambling on about it. Yeah, I mean, that kind of covers the main thing from that one in regards to, okay, we're talking about central adaptations there. Zone 2 may not. So it's that important when we're talking about being peripherally limited. I guess I'll add, I'm just trying to see what's on my notes here as well. I had some other stuff. Higher intensity is better. Yeah, so if we're looking at VO2 max anyway, we can still improve VO2 max with high intensity training. And it's going to be more time efficient anyway. And that's if we even really care about it. Sure, if you're like a recreational guy, really unfit, maybe just getting back into exercise after like years off, for sure, start with zone 2 low intensity work and just build a base of it. But if you've been training, multiple times a week for years and you're relatively active and things like that, adding more probably isn't the best use of your time. I'd say probably, it just kind of depends. Now, it's not to say you can't do zone 2, as I mentioned, if you're relatively unfit. If you're coming back from injury or a layoff, those are all good times to do it. If you're maybe going through like a deload kind of week and you want to just do something slightly different, you can do 30, 45, 60 minutes of various off-beat cardio equipment. Actually, a really nice way of doing it is Cal Dietz's contralateral, what do they call them? Contralateral circuits, I guess. If you just search contralateral circuit It should just come up actually just with that. Or you can search Cal Deeds contralateral circuit. Here's a whole PDF on with the various exercises. It's actually quite a good one. The idea is that you would just do it. You can just do it nose breathing, because then that kind of keeps you relatively low intensity. And essentially it's contralateral, meaning you're doing a left leg exercise with the right arm movement. And then you're swapping and doing right leg with the left arm. So example would be like a reverse lunge with a dumbbell press. And you would, he's got various time work to rest, I think, in that document, whereas like 20 seconds on, 10 seconds off, or there's like 15 on, 15 off, or 10 seconds on, that kind of stuff. So you can kind of go through a circuit like that. So that's one way you can do it, because it's low impact if you don't want to like sit on a row or something like that. Or you can, what I've done in the past is you can kind of do it on a circuit. So you can do like 5 minutes of contralateral circuits, then 5 or 10 minutes on a rower, then 5 minutes of contralateral circuits, and then 10 minutes on a bike, and then, you know, that kind of stuff. It makes it a little more bearable doing something like that as well. So that's something you can implement into your training if you like, if you want some of the low intensity work done. Obviously, there are other modalities too around your high intensity intervals, long and short. If you've read through the Ultimate MMA Conditioning book and stuff, there's also what I really like, the high intensity continuous training, but it requires you to have a spin bike that goes heavy enough on the resistance. And the only ones that I've found that do that are the Kaiser spin bikes. I don't think there are many. So I'm sure there are some other ones, but most other ones don't give you that. Like the ones where you have to turn the knob typically don't get you there. But essentially you're doing like 20, 30 RPMs, and you're standing and you're literally just like pushing down on the pedal each time really slowly for 10 minutes. Actually works really well as like a recovery tool, I've found. So we actually used to do it. So we actually had like the whole rugby squad. We would do it on a Monday. We'd play on a Saturday, and on a Monday, as part of our like lower day recovery-esque session, we would do 2 rounds of that for 8 to 10 minutes. And it just made your legs feel really damn good, because you're pumping a shit ton of blood through there. You're getting some relatively high forceful actions repeatedly. So you get some of that conditioning effect peripherally within that exercise, which is quite nice. And obviously there's no impact. So it's something you can do. Like, for example, you could probably do that, you know, on one of your maybe low intensity days to facilitate some of the conditioning and recovery as well. If you just search high intensity continuous training, I'm sure there'll be some stuff that comes up on Google and whatnot. Outside of that, yeah, that's just my thoughts on that book and things like that. I think I covered a lot of the other conditioning stuff about that Zone 2 paper. Definitely check that out as well. I think I'll put up a carousel post on Instagram tomorrow or something like that. If you follow on Instagram, I've just been posting a lot on there. But I also wanted to touch on this idea of optimization, and I guess, I don't know, I'm going to somehow tie it into worst case scenario. I'll figure it out within this. But I was actually writing an article. I'll probably try to finish this up and send it to Hammer Media. If you don't follow HMMR Media, you should hunt. If you're like looking, if you're just like, I think there's a few people that listen to this podcast, or at least follow this, and they just have this thirst for like solid training, strength conditioning, whatever, and coaching information. You need to follow HMMR Media on Instagram, go to the website and stuff like that. That's my, I would say that is the number one resource just for like coaching, strength conditioning information. I'm telling you now, like the information you'll get, they have a little membership as well, but the information in there is gold. Like you can't find that shit anywhere. It is epic from some really damn good coaches within they call it the GAIN networks. There was a GAIN conference that went for a good few years that honestly had one of the biggest impacts on my career, just in terms of learnings and people I met there. But it's really damn good. So it's headed by Martin Bingerser, who's been on this podcast a couple of times. You should definitely listen to him. And Vern Gambetta, who's also been on this podcast. And Nick Garcia, who's also been on this podcast, is a big part of that as well. So you should, check those out anyway, because there's some really, really, really good stuff. But I want to touch on, so I actually did an Instagram post recently on this kind of idea of, I guess, over optimization of fitness. And I'm going to somehow tie it into this worst case scenario that I was writing. But if you follow any kind of, I mean, you probably just see it, probably just turns up in your algo, to be honest. You know, all the big health and podcast influencers, and then you've got, the big CEO, tech bro, billionaires, all go through these optimization routines for health. It's kind of like They burn themselves getting to whatever it is, the place where they're so rich, and then they're so rich they're trying to like live forever, or they're just trying to fix their health that they fucked up through trying to get so rich. And it's funny, you see this push to the optimal protocol for XYZ, the morning routine. There's stories of guys like Peter Thiel, I think he's the PayPal guy or something. He flies his like mattress to like the different hotels that he's staying at. Some hotels like store his mattress in there so he can, get his normal night's sleep or whatever it is. And it's funny, like you have elite athletes like at the Olympics, at the Olympic level, within whatever, Premier League soccer, rugby, whatever it is. You have these professional athletes, and they don't do this. They're not flying their matches around. They're not optimizing everything. It's not to say they're not doing the things, they can and should be doing or have access to be able to perform better, but they're not taking it to this level where it's like every little thing has to be exactly in place. And there's a reason for this. And, you could say in a lot of cases with athletes, it's a money thing. Well, a lot of, like, for example, Olympic sports aren't funded well at all. Like, if you're not familiar with the Olympics is probably the biggest. Let's just say this is allegedly my opinion only. Olympics is the biggest fraud and scam organization out there in terms of what they do with athletes and how much they're, let's just say when there's organizations where the upper management of the organizations make more money and get all these free trips while the athletes struggle, there's a problem. And there's a lot of sports like that, and they all shit the bed. But stories for another time. As I was saying, what was I even saying? Now that I went off on that tangent, yeah, outside the money thing. The thing is, these CEOs and tech bros and whatever, they optimize for fragility. They make their routines in their life so fragile that anything can set them off. I don't know if you saw, I don't know if you guys are on Twitter or anything, but that David Sinclair fellow, the one that was pushing NAD for a while, and I think he got found out for being for being not honest. He's been using continuous glucose monitors, obviously because he's an absolute retard, just fucking following these dumb motherfuckers' trends and shit. And he's just like, he ate like a muesli bar before bed, and then he was like, my glucose spiked so much or whatever, and then he couldn't sleep that night, so he'll never do it again. It's like, bro, a muesli bar, meaning you can't sleep and you're worried about like glucose spikes from that, like that's the opposite of health and optimization. That is like the most fragile, weak piece of shit you could ever be if that's happening to you. And that's what these routines and what's being sold through these health influencers stuff is being sold to the everyday person about what they should be doing. Whereas you see the elite athletes and professional athletes aren't doing any of this, because you have to learn to be adaptive and you have to learn to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And that is something that athletes, they learn through their careers, because nothing is ever going to be perfect going into a competition. You're traveling overseas, maybe you're not sleeping well, maybe the bed isn't good, maybe the food, whatever it is. Obviously, you're planning to try and mitigate as many of these issues as possible. But, these things happen and not everything goes to plan. Maybe the bus is late to the game. Maybe you have less warm-up time because of that. Maybe the competition is delayed. These things always happen. And the best athletes in the world will adapt to anything that is there, and they will perform regardless of what has happened before that. A good example was the recent Olympics. Who was the sprinter that didn't? I think there was a sprinter that didn't end up sprinting the 100-meter because like they couldn't get into the thing. Like they had to walk an hour around the stadium to get in because the security guards wouldn't let them in or something like that. And I think they just didn't sprint the 100-meter final, one of the 100-meter races. Or I think one of them ended up doing it. I don't know. I'll have to look that up. But regardless, you got to perform regardless of what's happening. And having an optimized routine is going to do the exact opposite for what you need. The exact opposite. And it kind of brings me, I'm going to tie this in somehow, to this idea of worst case scenario training, where you are pushing the envelope to be able to be prepared for anything. And within I guess it's mainly used within team sports. It should eventually come to things like combat sports. But the idea is that you want to prepare for the worst things that can happen within a fight. And it doesn't mean like someone breaks your arm or some shit. Well, it could, but it's more like a really good example I've used before is like, if you remember a while ago, like I think it was Khabib versus Justin Gaethje, and just the absolute pressure that Khabib put on Justin through that first round. That would be a worst case scenario because he didn't even have space to breathe. He could barely throw strikes because Khabib was just on top of him the entire fight through that. And that would be a worst case scenario you could potentially prepare for, where you're trying to exceed the maximum speed or output from the competition. So a good example, I'll take it from rugby because that's where it's kind of mostly done. And I don't know if I'll do it like this again, but it gives a good idea. I don't know if I'd use this metric again, I should say. But for example, we would take like the peak meters per minute covered in competition. So meters per minute is just the distance covered in a minute from the squad. And I would break it down into 1 to 5 minute periods. And it would be like a rolling 1 to 5 minute periods. And it would essentially take the peak meters per minute in those time frames. And then within training, we would set up an exercise where we would play our structures at 30% faster speeds. So the goal is to essentially prepare players for for quote unquote game speed, but the worst case scenario game speed by exceeding that in training. If we can exceed the speeds and I guess the outputs in training, then within competition, you'll be prepared for, if this happens during competition. Same thing with contact. So I believe at the time, the peak contacts per minute in rugby were like, in terms of defense, was like 8 tackles in a minute. So then you would set up something where a player has to make 11 tackles within this specific drill per minute or in that minute. And that means now you're exceeding game speed. So when they have to make those, or if they have to make 10, they kind of understand how it feels and they can prepare themselves for it. Now, the same thing can be done for combat sports, where, could you take a grappling match where you see a certain number of actions, a certain number of shots, scrambles, etc., in a set amount of time, and somehow set something up where you're in these positions and you're having to fight your way out of them, in these time frames, with not really controlling the actions, but dictating where the fight or where the sparring or live training starts. Now, Jiu-Jitsu kind of does this already quite well because you have a lot of positional sparring in different positions. I think striking MMA could potentially that it's not as well, I'm going to say advanced, but it's not as prevalent where you may be designing things, with one player who's always attacking, one player always defend, or one athlete always defending, or only be able to having constraints when you're able to use certain movements or certain punches or kicks and things like that. And yeah, I mean, it's just a random thought that I've had that I think that could be really interesting, especially when we start to quantify, I guess, the activity within the sport, because currently it's been quite hard because you can't really use GPS to do that, even though it's been tried currently in the research. But once we get a better idea of what happens in the sport, then you could potentially look to change or build drills that I guess, give that worst case scenario training, if that makes sense. Lost my train of thought there at the end. But I actually have a question here in the chat. I'm going to say, hey, James, I'm a fan of your Dominate the Mats program. Recently read the Grappling Blueprint. Cool. So if anyone's listening and not sure what that is, Dominate the Mats is just one of the jiu-jitsu programs in the training app, if you want to check that out. Can you explain the shift from the zone 2 low intensity steady emphasis and Dominate the Mats to more of a high intensity dual training from the Blueprint? So I wrote those programs a long time ago. I might not have updated the conditioning. No, I think I did in 2.0. I need to go back and check. But within the training app itself, I give a whole range of conditioning, especially throughout, because I've got year-long programs in there as well. And obviously, because it's a generic program in the fact that I have to design it for not an individual person, but for just the general person that comes in, Oh, okay, he's got the first edition. Yeah, so it's been updated in the app back then. So my philosophy's changed a lot since that first one was written. That's probably why. But to explain also in the training app, there's a host of conditioning within the training year, just because I want to expose the people that come in to kind of like a bit of everything as they go through. And then that way it's not just one thing throughout, say, 12 months of training. At least, okay, we've done a bit of zone 2, we've done a bit of long intervals, we've done some short intervals, we've done some sprints, etc., etc. So it kind of gives the whole spectrum in there for the person to kind of get a sense and feel of the different training modalities. The shift from zone 2 to more of a high intensity interval approach, I kind of just covered. Funny enough, I just covered that in this podcast earlier. So you can go back and listen to that. And plus, there's a bunch of videos on the channel as well where I've really gone deep into this recently. Any of the conditioning videos that have been out the past few weeks will also answer that question too, around conditioning. That's not to say you can't use a low intensity approach. You can, but there are potentially better ways to go about it, and you can get similar adaptations from high intensity tools anyway in less time. So bear that in mind. Hopefully I didn't make a meal of this worst case scenario chat that I was trying to go through. But yeah, I think that covered everything, covered all the optimization stuff. Please, again, leave a review for the podcast on whatever podcast channels you're on. Let me know again about if a book would be of interest to kind of reference back to. The only thing with the book that's kind of stopped me doing it is it probably have to be updated so often that that would kind of be a pain. And books don't make money. So it'll be a lot of time to go in for pretty much no money. But if it'll be really, really helpful, then I may consider doing something like that anyway. I think that's everything I had. Let me check if there's something I had posted recently around. No, not really. Not really anything to cover. Actually, one of the other things is this idea of developing versus expressing power. I think that's quite interesting around it's often brought up when they're talking about force velocity or load velocity. I guess the force velocity spectrum, where it's like, okay, I'm just going to train the velocity end and the force end, and everything in the middle was just not enough force, not enough velocity to matter, which is where kind of peak power is. And so anything that you're doing with load is just expressing power, not developing it, which I think is entirely false and doesn't make any real sense, because everything you do is an expression of force, because every movement has a coordination element. So does that mean that you're just expressing force with various movements or expressing speed? No, you're still going to get adaptations like increased rate of force development from moving moderate to heavy loads quickly. Just because it is high power and not reaching, say, peak forces or peak velocities, doesn't mean you're not going to get the adaptations from it. You'll find that movers like Olympic lifts are typically high forces at relatively high velocities too, or even loaded jumps. Yeah, so I wouldn't say you're just expressing power. You're still developing power in those instances. Plus, you probably have very high impulse, which is probably a more important metric to look at than just peak or average force in a movement. The impulse momentum relationship, force times time, being impulse equals mass times velocity. So typically you'll see that impulse equals the change in velocity, which is what we are after within sport. So yeah, that kind of rounds out this podcast anyway. And before I rant on too long about other random shit. So let me know about the book. Let me know about all this other stuff. Thank you for listening. And I'll catch you in the next episode with a guest next week.